and welcome to the Everyday Farmers Conference, getting started with small ruminants. My name is Delaney Drake. I am the host and coordinator for this conference. We are super excited. It's all about goats and sheep and just how to get started with that in your backyard or as a business. The talk today is going to be focused on wool and yarn and cashmere and basically how you turn the hair and the wool from the sheep and the goats into clothing. And so I have three lovely ladies with me today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but they are, I don't know if they'd call themselves experts, but they know definitely a lot more than I do about the wool and the cashmere, and they just are going to share so much information, and I'm really excited. And so we have today Casey Dowell, Amanda Roberts, and Ann Keenan. And before we get into the questions, I just wanted to let them all introduce themselves. And I think we're going to start with Amanda, if you're good to go.
Okay. I'm Amanda Roberts. My farm is Wild Hair Studio. I'm located in Tennessee, about halfway between Knoxville and Nashville. And I raise Romadale CVM sheep, Gotland sheep, and then I also have a small flock of crossbred sheep. The Romadale CVM sheep are a critically endangered American heritage breed, and I've been working with them for just over 10 years now. The Gotlands are a newer interest, and I've only had them for probably 3 or 4 years now. And the crossbreds go back, some of those ewes trace back to my original starter flock several years ago. Overall, I've had sheep for over 20 years. My focus is fiber. That's kind of my interest, and because of that, I also set up a small studio on the farm where I do indie dye work, and I create more than just the roving. I have bats and an assortment of ready to spin items for spinners, felters, to try to get a different market than just the raw fleece appeals to.
All right, then can we move to Casey?
Hi, I'm Casey Dowell, and I live on a homestead in Virginia, and we currently raise chickens and pigs, and then in the spring we will be adding a flock of sheep, which is I'm super excited about. And I've been working with fiber for about 6 years now. It started with crocheting, and then that led to knitting and weaving and spinning. And so yeah, so that's what I like to do in my free time when I'm not homeschooling my 4 kids.
That's a lot. That's a lot to do.
Yeah.
I have a 2-year-old toddler, and I'm like, yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Let's go to Ann.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Ann Keenan, and I have Pine Needle Farm cashmeres and Wild Mountain Handmade on my Etsy shop. And I raise cashmere goats, and I've had them since 2001. And I learned how to spin. Well, I was crocheting before then, but then I learned how to spin. And a few years ago, I took up weaving, so now I spin and weave and do a little crocheting still. And then, but yeah, I've got a herd of 33, I think, cashmere goats now. I used to have 80 something, and that was just too much to take care of for one person. So I'm in the 30s, and it's working out pretty good. And I'm spoiled because, you know, cashmere is super soft, and I get to work with it all day. And so.
Okay, great. So I kind of want to go at this with the questions for like how, like from the very, very beginning up to the clothing. So when it comes to you guys either selective breeding or bringing in new animals to your flocks or your herds, what do you guys look for the what do you look for in the animal that would entice you guys to either keep it for breeding or to introduce it into your flocks and herds? And anyone can answer from this point on, kind of, if anyone has an answer. You can just kind of start and we'll go from there. If not, I will start calling on you.
Well, I feel like since I don't own a flock yet, I'll leave it to the experts who already have a flock.
Okay.
One of the things working with an endangered breed is that your gene pool is very small. And there's not, depending on where you live, there might be breeders close, but for me, there's not breeders close. So if I'm looking at adding, usually it's a ram, but sometimes it's a ewe, I'm specifically looking at an animal that's going to bring new genetics to my flock. I use Flock Filer, and I will run inbreeding coefficients to make sure that if I'm buying a ram or even if I'm buying a ewe, potential breedings with the animals I have are going to be far enough apart or unrelated enough that I'm keeping that inbreeding coefficient low. So that's a big thing for me, and part of that is because I work with the smaller breed, or the breeds that have less numbers than some of the big breeds. I'm also looking, especially with Romedales, they come in a variety of colors and patterns. So if I can get an animal that brings new genetics but also brings a different color or pattern, that's a plus. That's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it's a plus. I also look for the complete animal. I don't want necessarily the one that's going to bring me the best fleece, because experience has shown the best fleece may not have the best structural correctness underneath. I mean, you can go to an extreme on one thing and you give up a lot of other things. So, I mean, you may find that exceptional animal that brings everything together, but more often you're going to find one that's better than average, but it's middle of the road on some things. So I'm focused on bringing that package that improves my genetics, improves my wool quality, but also improves just the overall. It has to have something underneath to put the wool on, or I mean, you don't have something you can really work with, if that makes sense.
So for heritage breeds, it sounds like to get every single thing lined up, that it would be like finding a unicorn. It'd be like, it's hard to find.
It's more of a challenge. Before I worked with the Romedales, we had Dorsets, and Dorsets are a wonderful breed, but there's hundreds, I mean, literally hundreds of breeders within the country that breed Dorsets. So it's very easy to find a new ram, a new ewe. I mean, they're plentiful. When you start working with the heritage breeds, and even the Gotlands, they're a new breed for the United States, so they're not that populated yet. But with Romedales, you're looking at less than, and I haven't looked at the numbers, I should have looked before today, but it had been less than 20 breeders. Wow. So, I mean, it does take a lot of, I guess you'd say, research, because you may talk to one breeder and they may have one that looks nice, but then when you get to pulling actual, I guess, background and all, it's not something that's going to bring a lot of new genetics to your flock.
Okay, great. Anna, do you have a similar situation with the cashmere goats?
Well, they're not super popular, but yeah, I'm starting to breed for smaller goats, because in Montana there's not a big meat goat market, and cashmeres are usually bred or talked about as dual purpose, both fiber and meat. And since people in Montana aren't really big on goat meat. It's a long ways to haul them to a market. And plus I'm getting older, so I want to have easier to handle animals. So I've been breeding for smaller goats. And so I look for, I've got a nice little core group of smaller goats that have really good coverage of cashmere in there. And you look for this finer microns, like 14 to 16 is ideal. And it can be cashmere up to either, depends on who you talk to, either 18.5 or 19 microns. And to be classified as cashmere, it needs to be 1.5 inches long, up to 3 inches long, with plenty of crimp and not a whole lot of luster. So it's kind of a flat, it's not really shiny fiber. But there's quite a few breeders out in Washington and Oregon, and there's a couple here in Montana. I'm on the search for a new buck right now because my bucks are all getting pretty well related to everybody, so I can't really use them for breeding anymore.
Yeah.
But
Okay, so
I think all the breeders are about the same. You look for conformation and fleece quality and stuff.
So that kind of leads to another question of mine. So when it comes to either the sheep or the goats, does weather affect their coats at all? Or is it they produce this much on average every year? Or it fluctuates a lot depending on the weather or their food? Because I know that for at least milk, depending on the age and just the genes and the weather, it can all affect milk production. Is that very similar to wool, where the or wool and cashmere, is that depending on external and like nutrition that affects their wool and their hair, or is that just they make this much every year?
On the cashmeres, it's more genetics. But you have to be careful because if you feed them too much protein, that coarsens their fiber.
Okay.
So there's a fine line between starving them and feeding them well and getting a good fiber. But it's more genetics than weather for the fleece quality.
What about for sheep? Is that similar?
I would say it's a combination. Just because I know breeders in colder climates, and they will say, we're getting 4 inches of fleece off of this bloodline. Where I'm in a hotter temperature, I usually don't get that. I'm down in the 3 to 3.5 range. And I don't know, this is my guess, but I think some of that is due to the climate. You see the really longer fleece lengths in farms that are north of me, that have cooler weather longer. Another thing, I will say this, I do not coat. The prominent theory is that you should coat them, that keeps them cleaner and therefore that's better. My personal experience, I've done some experiments with coats and without. It doesn't necessarily keep them cleaner. It's a worry because they can get that coat snagged on something, and then you've got a sheep that's stuck or maybe hung or maybe even hurt, and if you don't find it, that's a problem. I did change my management practices, and that made more impact on how clean my fleeces were than them wearing a coat. So I know that's a very popular idea, is that they need to wear a coat, and mine don't. But if we have really wet weather, that takes a toll on the fleece. And I can't explain why, but if we have a really wet winter, I can nearly count on I won't have the quality fleeces that I would if we have a little drier winter.
Okay. That's
I would say just.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Casey.
sorry. I was just gonna say I've just from like doing my podcast and everything and talking to a bunch of shepherds, I definitely have heard that nutrition can play a part in it, and for them having to grow the wool and how much forage you have. And then I've also heard that the older the sheep get, sometimes their wool can get a little bit coarser. That's just some things that I've heard.
Yeah, and for those, for the audience members who don't know what the coats that Amanda was talking about, those are like jackets, right, Amanda? Those are like things that people will put over sheep to kind of protect their wool.
Yes. Most of them kind of start at the kind of the base where the neck and the shoulders meet, and they'll cover them basically their whole body. It doesn't cover them underneath. It leaves their belly, I guess you'd say, open, and then it comes back to kind of where their tail doesn't go all the way down on their rear end, but it kind of comes to the top. So in theory, if you think of it as a blanket fleece, and I don't know, that's a term that you see more with alpacas, but that's going to be your prime area of fleece, and it's covered in the jackets or the coats.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that the audience kind of understood that it was a difference between their actual wool and what they're wearing. And do they do that with goats? Do they use jackets?
No, because the goats just pull it off each other and tear things up. Goats, you can't coat a goat. They chew them off.
I wouldn't think that would be a good idea with the horns and stuff.
Yeah, I tried it one year on one goat, and it's like, no, it's not happening. They just tore all the other goats tried to pull it off, and they were chewing on it, and the goat that had it on kept itching it with her horns, and it's like, it just didn't work.
Oh,
I have to be very careful how I feed them hay and stuff, because I have a couple of them that get right under where I throw the hay, and so all the hay falls on them, which of course then it gets in their fleece, which is not good at all.
yeah, I
There's
know.
such a process to get the actual cashmere that by the time, well, there's still some left in it, but you can pick it out pretty good by the time it gets back to being spinnable and stuff.
Yeah, I know my sheep. It was first my ram, but now my girls are doing it because they're all together. They all have seeds all over them because they got into some bush, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna take forever to clean out. Do you guys do anything? But so before we get into the shearing or the what do they call it for the combing for the goats? Do you guys do anything for your sheep before they even go to the cutting or the taking off of the wool and the cashmere? Like, do you guys do baths? Do you guys try to do anything by hand?
Go ahead, Amanda.
I don't. I mean, like I said, it is I guess you'd say a year-round thing. I don't use feeders that they reach up in. I feed in something that they basically reach down in, because like Ann was saying, if they can reach it and pull it out on them, then it's down in that fleece. So that's just a year-round management thing that I do. They do have to be dry. Well, they don't have to be, but I make sure that they're dry if at all possible, because if you shear a wet sheep, which you can, I mean, it will work, but it will dull your blades. And a lot of times if you have a shearer coming, they will refuse to shear them wet.
And before I start combing them, I kind of brush their hair backwards to get or I try to get most of the vegetation out of it. And so brushing it backwards lightly seems to work pretty good.
Okay, great.
And then I just
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Okay. So before we get into shearing, because I know that's a little bit more known, Ann, can you talk a little bit about the difference between like shearing and combing for goats for your cashmere?
Okay. There are quite a few people that still shear their goats, but when you send it off to get it dehaired, that the mills charge by the incoming weight, and guard hair weighs a lot more than the cashmere does, their outer guard hairs. And so if you have the time, it's better to comb them. Plus then they aren't bald, because they start shedding in January. And so, and you comb them when they start shedding. It's like combing a dog. And so if you, let's see, how do I want to say this? If you shear them in January, and I live in Montana, and most of us live in the colder areas, then they don't have any protection at all. But when you comb them, then they still have their guard hairs, so they still have somewhat of a coat, so they don't freeze to death. And then I always feed them extra hay for a while afterward, till they start, till it warms up, or they start shedding their secondary coat, which I call their. My goats go through a thing where after I comb them, then about a month later or 2 months, they shed their guard hairs, and then they grow a whole new coat of everything. And so, but the combing, you just do it like a dog. And I use this to comb them, which is just a dog comb. I've tried everything, and this seems to work the best for my herd. But there's different kinds of cashmere goats. Some of them have a really thick coat that you pretty much have to shear, because it's more almost like sheep. It's just so condensed and thick, it takes hours literally to comb them out. So I had a couple of those kind, and I got rid of them because I like to just do the combing. So.
And the guard hair is not what you use for the cashmere, correct?
Right. Yeah, the guard hair is just their outer hair. They're the long straight hair, or short straight hair. Then the color of the guard hair and the color of the cashmere has no relation. Because most of my black goats, their guard hairs are black, but their cashmere is either gray or cream.
Oh.
There is no true black cashmere. You have to dye it to get black.
How long does it take?
I hear a baby.
I hear a baby.
Sorry, guys.
How long does it take you to comb it? I'm assuming you do it by hand?
Yeah. It takes about an hour on each goat.
And you said you have 30?
And I put them up on a stand, and I give them some grain, and most of them love it. The first time, the new ones, like the yearlings, they're not sure if they're going to live or die through the thing, but then they figure out that oh, this feels kind of good, getting an all-over body massage and scratch. So then they're okay with it. And some of them just stand up there perfectly still, and they don't move a muscle, and they just eat their grain. And then I used to have one, she would actually take a nap while I was combing her. So, she really enjoyed that.
How often do you?
And you see on I have a hard time, because there's a lot of PETA and stuff that says you have to kill the goat to get the fiber off and everything. And there's all these rumors going around, and it's cruel and all this stuff. And it's not. I mean, it's just, they just shed it naturally, and you're just getting it as they're shedding it. So
is it very
it's
similar
not cruel.
to where it's actually healthy to do it?
Yeah, they can shed it themselves. They'll walk around and rub on fences and stuff. I have a lot of cashmere lined fences. But it's a natural process they go through. So they could be and cashmere goats are the least domesticated of any breed, because they were in Australia and stuff, they were developed from feral goats, and then they were bred up for their fleece quality and stuff. And so they revert back to, I was reading some article that they will revert back quicker to a wild state than any other animal except a cat, like a domestic cat. So if I don't handle mine all the time, and I do have a couple of wild ones, but if I don't handle them a lot, they revert back to, you're not going to touch me, there's no way. So they just turn into wild goats again.
And how often do you comb? Is it just once a year?
Yep. Yeah, and you only get 3 or 4 ounces of usable cashmere off each goat. That's why it's so expensive. You only get it once a year, and there's just a couple of ounces instead of pounds.
Yeah.
So.
It's great stuff, though. I love cashmere. So Amanda, let's go over to what we do for the sheep. I'm curious about this one because I have sheep that we haven't sheared yet because they're under a year. So.
The sheep do need to be sheared each year, and depending on your breed, they may be sheared twice a year. For example, the Romedales get sheared in the spring, and that takes care of them until the next year. And an average shearing, you're looking for something hopefully at least 3 inches long. Unless something happens, my ewes will be in that 3 to 4 range as far as length. And when I say I didn't have a good example because most of my raw fleeces have already went. But this is kind of what you're going to get from a raw as a raw, and this is just like a little tiny piece. But you're going to shear that off in the spring. The Gauntlets you shear twice a year. You don't have to, but if you don't shear them, their fleece will mat really bad, and you end up, the sheep's uncomfortable, and then you end up getting something that you can't really use. The Gotland sheep have locks, and this is a lamb's fleece, so it's short. I don't know how well you can see, but it's truly, they'll use the locks for, some people use it for doll hair, where you get the individual little curls, and that's what you get from the Gotlands. They're considered a long wool sheep, and your long wool sheep, like I said, if you don't shear them twice a year, you usually end up with 7 or 8 inches of fleece, but it's going to mat. It's best to go ahead and shear them twice a year.
Okay, great. So you comb yourself, and Amanda, do you shear yourself, or do you have someone come over?
That's kind of a loaded question. I can shear myself, and I have done it before. This year, because of COVID, it was hard. People weren't traveling. So we ended up, and I sheared my entire flock this spring. Ideally, I have a shearer that will come. He shears them in like a day and a half, and he shears around 40. That's my flock in the spring. If he comes in the fall, everybody doesn't get sheared, but he will shear them in a day and a half. I take several days to shear them, so it becomes a time issue. It's just easier and quicker to have him come do it.
Do you find, I mean, I have a hard time because I'm 5'3", wrestling sheep just to like do hooves. Do you find that that it's hard just to contain them, or do you have a setup to where you can flip them over real easy?
When I shear, I don't flip them. I have a stand and I put them up there. And that's not bad, but it is slower than if you can get somebody to flip them and
turn them all over.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to watch them flip, and I mean, within a few minutes they're done. I don't have the strength to flip them, and then I also don't know all the little ins and outs of which way to turn them, and yeah.
Well, and it's beneficial when you're shearing to shear, see how I can word this, a certain way to where you're not getting a whole ton of the small pieces, correct? Like you really want to have the larger intact pieces.
That depends on what you're going to do with it.
Okay.
Now, you don't want second cuts, and second cuts are if you're shearing, and ideally your shears are going to ride just above the skin of the animal, and it doesn't cut the animal, it just cuts the wool and leaves just like a tiny little bit. If you, let's say let's say they jump, and instead of leaving a little bit, you left a lot. When you come back and even that up, then that's what they call a second cut, and that's what you don't want in your fleeces, okay? If you're selling to hand spinners, sometimes they will prize that fleece that's in a single piece. If you're processing it, if you're sending it to the mill to be processed, it really doesn't matter if it comes in one piece or little pieces, because in processing, it's going to become little pieces.
Okay, that makes sense. So after you guys are done shearing and combing, do you guys send it away to be processed, or do you guys process on your own?
I send mine to be dehaired to separate the guard hairs from the cashmere, the fleece. And then it comes back. I'll show you a little piece. It comes back in a cloud, and it literally feels like a cloud. And then you spin, I just spin it from this. And so, but there's a fine line between getting all the guard hairs out and ruining the cashmere. And so there's usually some guard hairs left. And when I start to spin, I like to just sit down and spin. I don't want to have to keep picking things out. So I go through each ounce by hand with some tweezers and pull out the remaining guard hairs. So then I have a really nice spinning experience. So, but that's all I do to mine is send it off to be dehaired, and then I do the rest.
And then you're good to just put it on the spinning, do you use a spinning wheel?
Yeah. Yep.
Now the process for wool is a little bit more in depth, correct, Amanda?
And I'll ask Ann, because I don't know, do the cashmere goats have like lanolin that has to wash out?
No, thank heavens. Just dirt.
Okay.
There's no lanolin or grease or anything. It's just dirt.
Okay. The sheep have lanolin, which is kind of a greasy, like, I mean, it's something they naturally produce. But in order to get that out, you do have to do, I'm guessing, a more intensive wash, because depending on how greasy or how much lanolin your fleece has, it may take multiple washes to get all that out. I send most of my raw model fleeces to the mill, and those come back as roving. And this is just an example of roving. The Gotland fleeces, if I'm doing roving, I send those to the mill. But if I have fleeces that I want to do locks, because there's a market for just washed locks, where some people use them in their spinning or felting. Some people use them like as they make dolls. I mean, there's a market if you have nice lock structure. If you're washing locks, I do that on the farm just because that's easier. The Gotlands have less lanolin than the raw models, so it's a little easier process, and it's just easier to do that myself than send it to the mill.
Have you done it? I mean, you said you have done it in the past?
When we first got the raw models, I thought it would be nice to just start to finish everything here. So I got a picker and a carder, and we started washing and picking and carding. And I found out really quick that I don't enjoy that process. Now, when it comes back from the mill, I still have a carder, because I'll do bats and I'll do other things. But that washing and picking, no, I'm happy to let somebody else do that.
Now, do you do wool and felt, or do you just primarily do wool? I might be using the wrong terms here, but is, I guess, maybe the difference between yarn and felt?
I don't have the mill send felt back to me, but I have people that buy roving and bats that I know are felters. So they're taking, I don't want to say it's raw because it's been washed, but they're taking my fiber and making felt.
Okay. And they take that from the mill? Like that just goes from the mill directly to them? They don't, because it doesn't go back to you?
No, it comes back to me.
Oh, it does?
Yes, the mill sends everything back to me. It comes in these, and this will depend on which mill you use, but my mill sends it back in like 14, 15 ounce balls. So the one I had, this is a piece of one. It's not it comes back in a big ball. And then most people are looking for a 4 ounce piece or a 4 ounce weight. That's kind of the standard packaging. And so it gets, depending on what I'm doing, it either gets divided up, because I do some natural roving, and that's pretty much straight back from the mill. But then I also do a lot, I dye and then do bats, and so it just kind of depends on where it goes from there.
So for Ann and Amanda, when you send your raw materials out, do you guys ship in like cardboard boxes, or is there a special way that you guys need to ship them in order for them to travel and not get damaged?
I just ship in cardboard boxes.
I do as well. I'll usually put them in a plastic bag inside the box, because hopefully I'm sending them more than one fleece or one. The mill that I use has a minimum batch weight of 8 pounds. So I'm typically looking at putting 2 fleeces or 3 fleeces together to make that minimum. But either way, if I can ship more than one box or one batch per box, I do. So they're in bags inside the boxes.
Okay. And
Yeah, I use bags inside the box too.
and there's no worry about moisture or anything?
I haven't
No,
had a
because
problem.
well, mine I put in the plastic bags too. So they're closed in a bag and then they're in the box. So
Okay, great.
they're pretty well secured.
And so from that point on, you guys move on to the actual spinning. Or am I missing a step?
Yep.
Yeah, once it comes back from the mill, it is in a ready to spin form.
And Anne, you said you use a spinning wheel. Amanda, do you use a spinning wheel?
I'm versatile. Depends on, I guess, which notion strikes. I have a spinning wheel, but then I also drop spindle and support spindle.
And can you explain a little bit about what that is? Because I know most people probably know what a spinning wheel is from like Disney, but
Okay.
Other things they're probably not as familiar with.
With a support spindle, and I have an example. This is a support spindle, and I don't have a drop spindle in here. But the support spindle rests in a dish, and I don't have a dish. I'm sorry. I wasn't prepared for this.
No, that's okay.
But it rests in a dish and it spins. So your weight is supported, and that's why it's called a supported spindle. This allows you to spin some really fine yarn or deal with some really fine fibers. It's not better than a spinning wheel, but if you're looking at, I have a sheep or I have a goat and I have fiber, I want to do something with it, you can invest less money in a spindle than a spinning wheel. The drop spindle is, most of them have a round top, and it may be anywhere from, I mean, it will be, it's not just round, it will have like a lot of times if you take a drop spinning class, they'll give you a class spindle and they'll make it with a CD and a dowel. So to kind of give you an idea of what it's looking like. The drop spindle is suspended. You have your yarn on the top and it drops. So the yarn you're spinning has to support the weight of the spindle. And the drop spindles come in a variety of weights. Some of them weigh less than an ounce. Some of them weigh more than an ounce. But still, in theory, you can spin a finer yarn if your yarn doesn't have to carry the weight of the spindle.
Okay. Wow, this is this is also new to me. I'm like, this is amazing. So once you guys have spun your cashmere and your wool into yarn, and it's called yarn, right? Once it's that process with the goats, it's still called cashmere yarn. Okay. So once you have the yarn, is this at the point where you guys dye? Is this the point where you guys dye?
Yeah, I usually dye most of mine in yarn form. Yeah. Yeah, I
dye more
tried
as a
dyeing.
living.
I'm scared to dye in the fleece.
I dye more as roving, just because I sell more of my fiber as ready to spin, to hit that market of somebody that's going to spin it themselves. I have spun and dyed as yarn, and it works either way. The fiber takes the dye a little differently, just because, and at least my thinking on why it does, is when it's roving, it's kind of a loose piece, and when it's yarn, it's more of a tighter piece, but it will readily dye either way.
So when it comes to the color of your guys' cashmere and wool, like what colors are like you don't dye at all because they just like browns you don't dye, they just stay brown, or Ann's like ready to go.
This is what comes off my black goats, and this is what comes off my white and cream goats. But this is the fiber that comes off the black goats. I call it aspen because I held it up to various trees around our place. I live in the forest, and the aspen bark matches this the best. So these are the two natural colors I have.
And do you prefer one color over the other?
It seems the white and the cream colors, the actual cashmere, is a little bit longer. It seems either that or they don't do it right at the mill. She probably does it right at the mill, but it's easier to spin, I think. But they both turn out nice. And you can, and the dyes, it's easier to dye the cream colored than it is the darker stuff. Oh, that takes dye good too, but it just makes it darker, more rich color, I guess. But
what about you, Amanda?
I like the natural colors, but I know everyone doesn't. The raw models, you get anything from a pure white all the way up to a really dark, it's considered black, but it's truly not black. It's more of like a really dark brown, and anything in between. So you get browns and grays, dark, light, the full spectrum. The whites will dye and give you bright, like neon colors. If that's what you're after, you almost have to start with white. But the light browns and light grays, and even on up to what I consider medium, and the example I have, I would call this a medium as far as how dark it is. All of those give you what I call jewel tones. I mean, they do really nice over dyes. I do have a group of views that are that really dark brown, and it will not over dye. It doesn't matter if you end up with brown. It's just so dark. The Gotlands, the really dark grays won't, they're like the dark browns, they won't take the dye and show any color, but any of the lighter, medium to lighter colors over dye really well.
What kind of dyes do you guys use? Are they natural, or do you guys use products that you get from the store, or how do you guys do the dyeing process?
I just use acid, what's called acid dyes, like Jacquard and what's the other one? Cushing's and things like that, where you just put vinegar in as the water as a mordant, and that's, I don't do a whole lot of dyeing. I do mostly natural colored stuff. So I would not call myself a dyer in any shape or form. No.
I use the acid dyes as well. I typically go with Dharma, but it doesn't matter. Either of the ones Ann mentioned are I wouldn't make a big difference between them. I haven't experimented with natural dyeing yet.
I actually just started dyeing, and I actually got pokeberries out of our yard and dyed with that, and it turned a really cool magenta color. I actually tried dyeing wool, long wool and cotton yarn that I had on hand, and the cotton yarn did not take the dye at all, and then the wool just turned a beautiful magenta color.
I love the idea of natural dyes, but I do know that sometimes not going natural kind of does produce, it's a more of a consistent, like, you know, this is the color you're going to get. Versus I think with natural dyes, it can kind of be like, depending on how long you keep it in there, how potent the berry or whatever it is that you used is. It's a little bit, I think, more like depends on what you use versus the stuff you can buy. So after it becomes wool, do you guys take your wool and actually turn it into clothing or gloves or hats, or do you guys kind of, is that the point where you guys hand it off to somebody else?
I turn it all the way into scarves and things. Like, I love this scarf, the plaid, and it's so soft. And I weave scarves and I crochet little wrist warmers, and I do weaving and crocheting of things. And I sell the yarn too, but
Most of my fiber goes as a ready to spin product. I do try to keep some, like I've got a scarf and a shawl that I use as demo to so you can see what this type of fiber will work up into. But I usually don't have finished clothing items.
So when it comes to, do you guys ever have any excess products that you don't use? I guess this would be like discarded or things that are not top quality that you guys repurpose into something else on your farm. Does that make any sense?
I don't know if this is what
you
you're,
like
I don't know if this is kind of what you're thinking, but before fleeces go to the mill, they get skirted, and anything that's excessively dirty, the belly wool, it comes out. It's not considered your prime fleece, and it doesn't go to the mill. If you have a place that's washing that you need some erosion control, that is excellent. And I'm sure you could put the good stuff in too, but that, you know, that's a really good way to help work to control if you have a spot with erosion.
the goat hair isn't, well, let's see. I used to have a dehairing machine myself, but we live off grid, so it used way too much electricity. So I ended up getting rid of it. But when I had it, I had a lot of the waste, like the guard hairs and stuff. And I would use that if it didn't have a whole lot of vegetation in it after the first pass or two. Then I would use that as stuffing for pillows and things. But now I just have I only get the good stuff back. So, and the stuff that I don't get enough, there's not enough really bad when I'm combing and stuff. There's not enough or any waste really to do much with anyway. So I get maybe a handful of icky stuff off the goats.
I think for what I was kind of, I mean, you guys answered it perfectly. But I just know that during some of my research that people have, like, with anything extra or any pieces that weren't used, they would put in, like, with their chickens, and the chickens would make nests out of it. Some people, I think, said compost. You can put it in your compost beds. So I was just curious as to if you guys did any of that kind of stuff.
I've gotten some sheep fleeces before. People give me, I have a whole bunch of all sorts of things, but I've taken some of the sheep's wool, just the raw stuff out of the bag, and stuck that around my water spigot thing to insulate it during the wintertime, and that worked pretty good actually.
Oh, okay.
So it does make good insulation.
What are your guys' favorite product that comes from your guys' farms?
Probably the cashmere yarn.
I would say bats, just because they're taking kind of a step farther than the roving, and they're a little bit more creative. So that, I guess, is a little bit more of, I guess, what I see, it becomes an actual thing. It's the creative process, I guess.
That's your favorite part?
Yeah.
What's your guys' least favorite part?
Cleaning the goat pen.
I was gonna say cleaning the barn.
Yeah. Well, because you guys got a lot
I
of
have a literal mountain of compost out there, and it's never ending. But I do sell the compost, so that's good.
Do you guys do other products like meat, or do you guys breed for the purpose of selling your lambs or your kids?
A little bit, but not much. There's not a huge goat market. Well, there is for dairy goats and meat goats, but cashmere goats aren't that popular around here. I have sold some in various, like over to Washington and stuff, but also people want bigger goats for some odd reason. So I don't sell a whole lot. I'm slowing down on the breeding too.
Is that just because you want to expand?
What was that?
Is that because you don't want to get a bigger flock, or you're just not focusing on replenishing your older goats?
I breed a few just to replenish, but I've gotten so people don't seem to take, I don't know how it is with sheep, but people seem, when they buy goats, they don't really take care of them. They just think, oh, they eat weeds, so they'll stick them out in a weed patch, and they don't do anything for them. And I've ended up getting a lot of goats back, because when I sell them, I always say, I'll take them back if you don't want them, because I don't want them to get abused or neglected or something. So I call them my boomerang goats, because I get quite a few back. And so I've decided that it's easier to just eat them than sell them most of the time. So I've started not selling so many. So I just replenish my old girls, and that's about it.
I do sell breeding stock. It's not a huge thing, just because in my area, most people don't know what Romedales are, and unless you can reference Gotlands as the connection with the Lord of the Rings movies, they don't know what those are either. So it's a challenge to sell something that people don't know what they are. I do breed, and I keep the top part of my lamb crop as potential breeding stock. I do everything else goes to the sale. So, I mean, that's part of it.
Okay, so it looks like we may have lost Casey. Probably baby needed her. So I realized that I was like, I allotted a lot more time to this than we probably needed. Do you guys have anything else you guys want to share that I didn't cover, that maybe you've heard people ask you guys before in the past? Kind of frequently asked questions that you get from, either people buying or people looking into having their own flock or herd?
Well, fencing for goats, fencing is a big issue, because there's a saying that if a fence can hold water, it can hold a goat. So you have to have really good fencing. And then the cashmere goats are one of the hardiest breeds of goats. They don't need a whole lot of shelter. They need to be able to get out of the wind and the rain, because all goats hate to get wet, or most all goats. And so I just use pallets, like stacked three-sided sheds with low roofs is what I use for most of mine. And well, I do have a couple of dairy goats, and they have a real barn and things because they're spoiled dairy goats. But the cashmere goats are pretty hardy, and so they don't need. Plus, they have all that cashmere to keep them warm all winter, so they don't need a huge, really fancy shelters. But the fencing for goats is the big thing. If you don't have good fencing, you're just going to have frustration all the way through. Because goats, there's always at least one that's their job, is to find a weak spot in the fence, and it's like, okay, here we go, and away they go.
So they all follow.
That's, yeah. And the fencing is the big thing with goats. They're the most lovable, frustrating creatures on the planet.
One of the questions that I get a lot of times, and this is specific to the Romadale breed, is what's the difference in a Romadale and a CVM? Because the association, their technical name is Romadale/CVM. And it's really, there's confusion out there, I think, and you get a lot of questions. If you call them Romadales, people don't know what you're talking about. And if you call them CVMs, oh, I've heard of those. Romadale is technically the breed. CVM is a pattern within the breed, and it's the most popular pattern within the breed. And somehow over the years, it just kind of became what everybody refers to them as. But the Romadale come, like I said earlier, in a variety of colors. The CVM is this very distinctive pattern where they have dark legs, dark belly, and these little dark markings on their face. So it's a very distinctive pattern, but it's within the Romadale as a breed. And that, I'd say that's what I get a lot of questions over, is just the difference. Why is it called two
So what
different
does
things?
CVM stand for?
California Variegated Mutant. And I don't know why they came up with that, but that's what it stands for.
I was in California, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like all of us. So, you guys said, I think you said, Ann, you have 30, and Amanda, you said you have 40 in your herds and flock. How many acres are you guys having your animals on?
We've got 20.
I have
My
around
neighbors sometimes want me to bring my goats over there for brush control to their place. So, but we have 20 acres ourselves.
I have close to 15.
Okay. So 40 of the sheep are on 15 acres, or is that, okay. Yeah, I'm jealous. We only have like 5.7. So I'm like, oh, I'm jealous of you guys. Trying to think if there was any other questions. I am going to be having a Facebook group during the weekend of the conference that people will be able to ask questions on if they listen to the discussion and have any questions. And I might tag you guys or send them your way because you guys are the experts, and kind of have them ask you guys. But that's going to be kind of the live interaction part where they're going to be asking questions that either came up during the conversation or that they just have had and that I didn't ask. Do you guys have anything you guys want to share with our viewers, whether it's, your website, where they can follow you, where they can buy any of your products, just sort of a wrapping up of, who you are and all that good stuff.
I have a website, and which is pineneedlefarmcashmeres.com. And then I'm on Instagram at Cashmere Annie. I'm not on Facebook though. And then I have my Etsy shop, which is Wild Mountain Handmade. So those are the places I am.
I'm going to share my Instagram, and I don't know if it, well, it's
Yep,
wild dot, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. That's my Instagram, and if you go to the link tree on the profile on my Instagram, it links to my Etsy shop and my website, and right now that's all I have linked, but if I get any more links, I'll put it in the link tree.
Okay, perfect. And I am actually going to be compiling some contact information that's in a single document, so that anybody listening or watching this who wants to connect with you guys but either missed this part or just want to see it written down, that I'll have that together so that they can reach out to you guys too. And I will try to connect with Casey and see what's going on with her, because I know she has a podcast that is all about wool and heritage breeds. So it's called Dearly Woven. And so I'll try to connect with her and see if I can get a little clip of her kind of introducing herself and asking her some questions, because I don't want to feel like she got left out. I feel like we got to the point where she could really participate and she left. Because I think she does mostly the knitting and the crocheting, which we could talk a little bit more about. But she's not here. So I'll try to connect with her. But yeah, her podcast is Dearly Woven. Thank you guys so much for doing this. This has been so amazing. And I'm so excited for all the other discussions, because I've learned so much, and I'm really excited to share this stuff with other people like me who are just getting into it or just researching it, kind of trying to figure out if this is for them or not. I think it really helps to kind of hear from someone who's done it and who's been at it for a few years, versus just kind of reading it from a book. I think that is super helpful. I mean, reading from the book is great. Research is great. Websites, YouTube, that's great. But being able to actually talk to you guys and see you guys, and kind of hear the difference between the sheep and the goats. I think it's just going to be so helpful. And that's why I put this conference together, was just for newbies, but also for people who are just interested to kind of absorb some of this information that you don't always get. So thank you guys so much for being on this conversation, being at this discussion. I know I've really enjoyed it. And I hope you guys do too.
Yep, thank you. It was
you
fun meeting you too, and it was fun talking, and so I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for putting this together, and it's been informative. I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about cashmere goats, so I've enjoyed listening to Ann and learning something today.
Great. Do you guys
Did it make you want to not get goats?
I mean, they sound interesting. I don't know.
the whole fact that they want to escape scares me a little bit, because we live right next to a freeway, and I was like, I can just imagine one hopping over the fence and just like getting into a lot of trouble.
One thing about cashmeres is they don't usually jump. They're not like dairy goats, they're not jumpers. But if your fence if there's a weak spot in it and they can poke their nose through it, somehow they get the rest of their body through it. And I used to have one that she would go along the bottom of the fence, and if there was a loose part, she would push under it, and if her nose went somewhere, she went somewhere. So they really do. You do have to have strong fences.
I did have one question, which is not really pertaining to wool. It's pertaining to the horns. Because I know that at least for like dairy sheep, they'll sometimes make sure that the horns don't grow. Do you guys, Amanda, you're doing a heritage breed. Do you get in trouble for like not having the horns if it's a breed with horns?
The Romadale can have horns, but they're both. You see some that are polled and some that are not. And the association doesn't make any preference.
Okay.
some breeders will make a preference, and I know personally, if I happen, and we did this past spring, we had a lamb that came up, the sire was polled, and I've used him. This is the 3rd year and no indication of anything. It was the 2nd year I had bred the ewe, but for some reason this little guy had horns, and he automatically got put on the list to go to the sale because I don't want to breed for horns. I'm specifically breeding against that. But I know of a breeder in Pennsylvania that specifically breeds for them. So it's a personal preference, I guess.
What about you,
And
Ann?
in the cashmere world, you're supposed to have horns. So, as you can tell, some of the bloodlines you can see by the way their horns are shaped, what their bloodlines are. Like the Spanish ones go way out, and they're kind of cool looking. I used to have some of well, actually, I still do. I have a line of Spanish, so they have really neat horns that go out, and so yeah. In cashmere, if you're showing them and stuff, they do have to have horns.
Okay. All right. Well, that was like the last question that was like kind of not pertaining to wool. I was just curious because I know that I'm pretty sure that at least for dairy sheep, it's kind of preferred that they don't, just so that they don't hurt each other. And so I was just curious as to if that affected, if choosing to not have horns was affected by the wool. But it sounds like it's not. It's more of a personal preference.